It's my pleasure to introduce the first panel this morning, titled Nation. As everyone might be questioning how to celebrate the concept of nationhood when the news cycle convinces us otherwise. Perhaps today, as we think around and with vegetal communities, we can look to the plants for hope, or at least a method of seeing the world differently. If we're to follow the plants, as Catherine suggests, we learn that plants connect, not divide across national borders. So I bring one of my favorites here today, and one that I think connects us to the panel in some ways, and to Philadelphia's start, the fever tree. So does a plant like the fever tree understand the geopolitical divide between the US and Greenland? Likely not. It's just as happy to grow in Sarasota, Florida, as it does in Cape Town, South Africa. And this illustration from William Bartram, from Philly's botanical Bartram's family, engraved by James Trenchard in 1786, shows a plant out of place. I tried growing the delicate fever tree in Connecticut because of its importance in synthetic chemical history, as quinine from the fever tree crossed the globe as a desired alkaloid derived from its bark, which gives gin and tonic its delicious bitter taste. Now wholly synthetic, it's not fever tree's fault that is difficult and often never takes adventive hold. Or that fever tree would become adventive, as indigenous peoples across several tropical climates knew fever tree was distinct in reducing fevers, or later as an anti-malarial salve, and would propagate its root suckers and lead to its adventive status in certain parts. So plants like the delicate, sometimes adventive fever tree resist a definitive understanding of nation or place, and our panelists today, like the fever tree, similarly offer ways of understanding other adventive plants in kitchens or prairies or along historic expeditions. And each panelist this morning, like the fever tree, pushes us to see adventive plants as things that defy nations, or rather those that hold and define communities of other kinds. So it's my pleasure to introduce everyone this morning, and I'll introduce all three panelists and then start with Rick to begin. So we're going to start today with Dr. Richard McCourt, who is the Botany Curator Emeritus at the Academy of Natural Scientists of Drexel University, who has taught at Drexel as the Professor in Biodiversity, Earth and Environmental Sciences Department since 2012. His research program focuses on the evolution, ecology, and classification of green algae, the primitive aquatic plants that evolved into the plants that dominate terrestrial ecosystems. In addition, he curates the plant specimens collected by Lewis and Clark on their iconic expedition in 1804 to 1806, which is at the Academy here in Philadelphia. And then we'll move to Chantel White, who is the teaching specialist for Botany in the Center for the Analysis of Archaeological Materials, CAAM, at the Penn Museum. She's also the senior lecturer in the Department of Anthropology in the School of Arts and Sciences. She received her BA in Anthropology from Beloit College in 2003 and her PhD in Archaeology from Boston University in 2013. Before coming to Penn, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the study of plant remains from the Near East, Mediterranean, and historical North America across a diverse set of archaeological sites, ranging from the Upper Paleolithic, 40,000 years ago, to the recent past, the 19th century. The shared goals of these studies is the reconstruction of everyday life, particularly the identification of identities related to the storage, preparation, and consumption of foods. So at the core of her laboratory work is a strong interest in experimental archaeology, focusing on cooking techniques and charting experiments to really better understand the archaeobotanical record. She directs the summer archaeobotany program in Greece, and teaches the Penn undergraduate and graduate courses in Plants and Society, which I want to take, Introduction to Archaeobotany, and co-teaches the Living World in Archaeological Science. And then we'll move to Rosalyn LaPier, who's an award-winning Indigenous writer, environmental historian, and ethnobotanist. Rosalyn works with Indigenous communities to really revitalize traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and to strengthen public policy for Indigenous languages. Rosalyn is the author of 2 books, including Invisible Reality, Storytellers, Storytakers, and the Supernatural World of the Blackfeet, produced 2 Blackfeet language lexicons, and has written dozens of articles and commentaries. Rosalyn is an enrolled member of the Blackfeet tribe of Montana and Red River Métis. So if everyone would love to have us welcome Rick McCourt today, we'll get started. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jessica, for the nice introduction. Thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. I have to say, this is probably one of the first kickoff events of the semi-quincentennial, I guess it's called. And I applaud you for getting it together so readily with your crew of people. It's a small world. A lot of people in the audience I know or I've taught with, I've written grants with, and so forth. And it's actually a small world, too, in very many ways. Let's see. How do I advance? There we go. I feel like an Adventive speaker in some ways. My study research area, which Jessica mentioned, is about the algae that turned into land plants a long time ago. If you talk about a plant that came out of somewhere and is not where it's supposed to be now, that certainly fits. But I won't talk about that today. I'm a little bit of an Adventive speaker, too, in the way that Meriwether Lewis, shown in this painting, was an Adventive adventurer. You know, because I gave the slides to Catherine a few days ago, I did not steal this from Banu last night, or from Catherine, who mentioned that the whole conference is an Adventive adventure in a way. I thought I was being very clever. But putting A, D, and V together, you can make a lot of words for this talk. This is a picture of Meriwether Lewis doing something he did on the trip constantly, in a sense. He collected anywhere from 0 to about 8 or 9 plants in a given day, all throughout the several, I think it was about 700 days of the expedition, more or less. And he's collected sporadically, but he did it pretty religiously in a sense, because he collected over 232 that made it back. And he probably collected as much as twice that number, some of which were lost because he buried them for safety in caches next to the Missouri River, which got higher while he was gone than he expected, and so he lost quite a few. And he lamented that in his journals. But this shows his kind of working technique in a bit of a romanticized way. It was hard work. If you consider how many plants he collected and how many minutes it would take to care for them, it was a finite amount of time that he spent caring for these plants and taking care that they made it back. He's pulling up here a plant. It looks like it has a white flower. I'm not sure why that is, because it's a very big purple background of camas flowers at Packer Meadow. He has his gun, his spear, and a piece of paper. Usually, Cindy, a botanist in the audience, can tell me, you usually don't press your plants in the field. That's not exactly a good workflow, but he's doing it here for the sake of artistic license. And he's going to put it in that paper and put it in the plant press you see on his left. I'm going to talk about his plant collecting in the context of botanical exploration here in America, and especially the linkage to Philadelphia, and Bartram, Barton, and Lewis and Clark. You could add a number of other names to that, which I will. And then finish off a little bit with what it has to do in my limited experience with indigenous plants and indigenous knowledge, and just sort of take off into that, or just point out the potential for it, and go from there. So this is Traveler's Rest, Montana. It's about an 11-mile hike west of it's east of where he was collecting plants earlier. They spent a well-deserved resting period here. And while he was there, Lewis found this plant, which has the scientific name of Lewisia rediviva, or common name of bitterroot. A really beautiful small plant with a very resistant kind of rhizome underneath. And it must have really caught his eye, and he described it in other places in his journals. But he did to this plant what he did to every other plant along the way, what every good botanist does, and my wife can tell you this, I'm good at this in gardening too. He killed it. And he pressed it flat, and he pressed the plant onto some paper, not this page, this was actually added later. All that's left here are the petals, though, because the dried root was brought back to Philadelphia and regenerated by Bernard McMahon and kept alive for about a year here in Philadelphia. But they didn't save it, and so all that's left is we have the petals. It was enough to describe a new species, though. Lewis didn't do that, and I'll mention briefly why that was the case later. Why was he doing this? Why was he spending time in shooting buffalo, looking for grizzly bears, interacting constantly with the Native American tribes he met? Well, he was doing it because he was ordered to do it. He was still a captain. Actually, he was probably resigned by this time or close to it. But he was taking orders from Thomas Jefferson, shown here. The greatest service which you can render to a country is to find a useful plant to its culture, which is a very interesting quotation. And it's sort of, I was looking at it this morning, I thought, does this mean that the worst thing you can do is introduce a harmful plant to a civilization? It's a question I think we might talk about in the panel. But he didn't talk about that. He was mainly interested in trying to take plants and make them into useful form. He was a farmer, he was an agriculturalist, he was a lot of different things, as we know, but he was very interested in plants. So an overview of the expedition, where they went. It's traditionally thought of as starting in St. Louis, that little dot in the middle there, heading up west all the way to Fort Clatsop on the west coast of the United States and coming back. I have circled on the right there where in some ways, the expedition really started, which was in Philadelphia and Monticello, with the previous slide. It was actually covered up because I think I'm going from the PDF here, so I don't have the cute little illustrations. But it started at Monticello in a way, where Thomas Jefferson was very interested through his library in exploring the western United States. He never went there. He never went west of the Appalachians, and so he was a vicarious explorer. But he wanted Lewis and Clark to go there, and so in 1803 and 1807 and beyond then, Philadelphia played a major role. Lewis was given very direct directives and objectives by Thomas Jefferson, and among them were to look at the plants he was encountering, and also the animals as well, and the geography, but especially the vegetable productions, especially those not of the U.S. Jefferson wrote this a few months before the Louisiana Purchase was signed, or he was notified of it. And so in a way, Lewis was looking at plants that were really part of the U.S. after the Louisiana Purchase was formalized. But this was, before then, it was part of Spain and maybe some French claims and also British claims as well. So he wanted to know what was there, ostensibly for scientific purposes, but scientific purposes can often stake other kinds of claims as well, and so he was doing that. He was not a trained botanist, though, nor was Clark. They were both military men, pretty good at what they did, and essentially, Jefferson got somebody to go west for this exploration after several aborted tries from other people who didn't quite make it. But he got people who were strong enough, experienced enough, and could take orders and run a crew of people in a wilderness situation and make it back alive, and that's what he wanted to happen. So he picked Lewis and Clark for this. He picked Lewis picked Clark. Lewis was more or less kind of like the early astronauts who were jet pilots. You know, they had to have thousands of hours in airplanes, not training in geology or chemistry or anything else. But he was really not quite equipped to go to the West. And so Jefferson sent him here to Philadelphia. That big red dot in the middle is approximately where we are. That's Market Street, or going down the middle there. And you can see a circle around Hamilton's estate, which is the Woodland Cemetery. I'm turned around here, so I'm not sure which. That's downtown. It's somewhere over here. Yeah, the Woodland Cemetery is over there. Down the river from there, on the same side, is the Bartram's Garden, which I've also circled. And he probably spent some time there, but it's not really written about much. I don't have any documentary evidence I'm aware of that he went to Bartram's Garden. He had an indirect connection with Hamilton, William Hamilton, who owned the Woodlands, through a gardener who worked for him. But he mainly spent his time in what's downtown Philadelphia there, marked with tutors, because he was talking to people like Caspar Wistar, Benjamin Rush, and most of all, for the plants, a person I'll get to on the next slide. Bartram was nearby on the river, and William Hamilton as well. I picture them here because they're pretty well known. William Bartram was in his 60s at the time, and I think Jefferson might have liked him to go if he could, but there's no way he could have gone on this expedition. William Hamilton was just a gentleman plant collector in a sense, and was not interested in going. Nor was this fellow, actually, who was probably young enough to go in a sense. He was in his 50s at the time, but still he was ailing, but he was a great teacher, and he's here at the University of Pennsylvania. He was in the medical school. He was a professor of materia medica. I guess we'd call that pharmaceutical botanics at the time. And he was the foremost botanist in the country at the time. He wrote the first textbook of botany called Elements of Botany, shown on the right, with a picture of the Venus flytrap by William Bartram, who illustrated most of the book. Benjamin Smith Barton was his name. He was a remarkable guy. He probably reaped more than he sowed, from what we can tell in his biographies and his projects. But he did teach Lewis about plants. And, oh darn, it's going to hide part of it. But what you can't see are a couple of volumes that we have over at the Academy of Natural Sciences, assembled in 1795. Imagine a book with pages in it, interleaved of white paper with purple blotting paper, which you can see on the left there, with plants, formerly living plants, pressed onto them, put on there at 1795. They're still in really good shape today. You can see it if you come over. Not at will, but we do keep it for special occasions. And what it presents there is kind of an interesting sort of Shroud of Turin type of effect there, where the blotting paper on the left has the impression of the plant on the right. And if you can read that a little bit, if we can, it says from Bartram's garden. So many of the plants that were in there were from Bartram's garden, which actually came from elsewhere because Bartram collected it from all over the place. The Bartrams did. So probably Lewis, we think he must have seen this, and he learned that this is how you collect plants. You don't maybe make a book out of them, but you need absorptive paper to put them in, and so he did that. This was the modus operandi for the trip. Lewis was wandering around on the shore most of the time with his dog Seaman, you can see in the back there. And on the river was William Clark and the rest of the men. There were hunters as well going off and doing hunting on land as well, but mainly they were carrying things up and down the river in boats, and then when they couldn't use boats, other means. But Lewis was spending time on the shore, and when he was doing that, he was spending a lot of time doing what we call botanizing, that is collecting plants, observing plants, and so forth. And these are some of the things he looked at. These are particularly beautiful plants, I think, that represent what he collected. Bear grass on the upper left, which is used by Native Americans to make beautiful conical hats that are at the Peabody Museum now. Arrowleaf balsam and so forth. There are 3 state plants on here. They were not states at the time, obviously, but later they became them: mock orange, bitterroot, and Oregon grape. And then ragged robin, which is Clarkia pocella. Clark didn't know it, but he would have a plant named after him, which turned out to be very important genetically. It's almost like a model system for some plant genetics in the past. And then on the far right, Arikara tobacco, which was not native to the areas they were in, but cultivated there. And I'll make a comment about that later. And bitterroot at the top. And this is what they look like now at the Academy of Natural Sciences. Really beautiful. Brown, dead, but pressed and remarkably in pretty good shape for the fact that they're 220 years old now. They're still important scientifically. There are many of them type specimens. That is, the specimens used to describe a new species to science at the time, and so they're types. They also are biochemically interesting. Of course, this was collected in 1804 to 1806. DNA was invented when I was born, basically. So it is rather ancient, but not that old. And so not compared to this. So they had no idea that there would actually be DNA in the plants that could be extracted now, or other biochemical compounds. Of course, to do that, you have to destroy them, so we don't grant willy-nilly permission to do that. But occasionally it happens, only a couple of times so far. So this is what it looked like. Unfortunately, Lewis never said, I have I'm so happy. I just went out and bought myself a plant press today. We have no idea that he actually bought one. He must have had one, though, because of what the plants looked like. Sort of like the finished product tells you he had to have pressed them flat, dried them, got all the water out so they didn't rot. And this is me imitating that here. Of course, we have newspapers, we have a better blotter paper and cardboard commercially available, and they didn't have any of that. And this is again showing a little bit about the book on the left and a specimen on the right. The blotting paper shows up later and still is on about 3 dozen specimen sheets that we have at the Academy. That's handwritten notes by Meriwether Lewis himself. And so somewhere at an eBay or a garage sale, you might find some of these. It would be handy to have them. Please send them to us at the Academy. But when they were thrown, somebody threw out hundreds of them, not realizing that they would have some interest and value in the future. There's a lot of other labels on there, and I'll mention that in a minute. He also, Lewis that is, he was mainly the plant collector. Everybody else may have helped out a bit. He doesn't talk about it that much, but he was really the plants person. He wrote a lot about them in the journals, and he learned about them from Native American tribes he encountered and wrote about that as well. These are just some of the little diagrams that it's kind of fun to see. If you know Douglas fir, you know that little skinny squished mouse tail that is something that sticks out of the pine cone. Bracts is something you see. There's a fern leaf and a maple leaf and so forth. And you can match these up with the specimens themselves. So he wrote about these things, he drew some of them, and he was making very detailed descriptions of them. In fact, this is the last page of the journal that Lewis ever wrote, and he had great handwriting, I have to say, much better than mine, or most of his contemporaries, it seems. But if you read this page, and you can't obviously, but he describes in great detail a specimen of cherry. Just the day before, he had been shot in the backside by a man on the expedition by mistake. And so he writes that he had to lie on his stomach in the canoe, and he said, as writing is extremely painful, I'm going to let Captain Clark do the rest of the writing, but I just have to mention a singular cherry I found on this trip. And about 3/4 of the page is the technical description of the cherry. And it's rather remarkable. He must have been in severe pain, and he didn't die, but he did heal, but it took a while. He was shot 1 bullet, 4 holes through the backside. You can kind of imagine the trajectory, but it was written up in detail in the journal. On the lower left is a little postage stamp added by Elliot Cowes, who is a person who transcribed all the notes and did a write-up later. And on the right is the specimen, the actual plant he was talking about. It's a little bit of a grungy specimen, but it's a specimen of cherry. And this is the last thing he wrote. So he says, I've never seen it in bloom. And that was the last words he ever wrote in the journals. Now, this is not quite as dramatic as it seems. He didn't pass out or get too ill to write. He had long periods of time when he didn't write, and people wonder if it was a bit of his depressive personality. But the last thing he ever wrote was about the plants. And so it was obviously very important to him while he was in great pain to do it. And I'll finally mention a bit about the indigenous contributions. It's well known, that what they wanted to do was interact with the Native Americans. They were told questions to ask them about their lifestyles and so forth, about the medical treatments they used, and they needed them to survive. Obviously, it says, Stephen Ambrose, who wrote a biography of Lewis, said it was Mandan corn that got them through their first winter, basically. And Jim Rhonda, who wrote a book about 30 years ago about Lewis and Clark among the Indians, said it was obviously very important in his phrasing here. But he also points out something interesting, was that although the journals reflect the biases and prejudices and feelings of Lewis and Clark, they did appreciate what help they were getting from the natives, in spite of the fact that they obviously considered they were superior in a sense. But they also kind of gave voice, according to Rhonda, to some of the Native Americans at the time, so that their statements, their speeches, and a lot of their information was recorded in the journals. And the other thing that Rhonda mentions is that the Native Americans were exploring Lewis and Clark just as much as Lewis and Clark were exploring them, so to speak. They were on the bank looking out and seeing, what was this? And they asked them a lot of questions about their garb and their fashion, what they were dressed like and so forth. So they were being explored as well, but that doesn't come through in the journals. Obviously, they didn't know or didn't quite realize that. This is the route. They encountered 50 tribes along the way. This website no longer exists. The website exists, but this map doesn't. I looked for it the other day, so unfortunately you can't see it. But they encountered a lot of tribes and gathered much information from them. It was a lot of it sort of piecemeal and wasn't really written up, that I'm aware, as a monograph per se. But related to the plants themselves, I wanted to mention the herbarium sheets themselves contain some of this information, and it remains to be mined in a sense. I'm doing a little bit of it with my work, but everybody is welcome to do it. We're digitizing these specimens. They're actually available online if you dig a little hard. And you can see a specimen sheet with all of these labels on them. Heather Sharkey, who's in the Near East Studies Department here at Penn, and I and Jordan Teicher from Missouri Botanical Garden presented a paper about what we called microhistories. And I apologize for appropriating the name, but it's a thing in history, I guess. Small events, small items that can be expanded out to bigger stories. And the labels on the specimen sheets actually qualify in this sense. And here's an example of that. This is a Clatonia specimen collected by Lewis. And one of his tags is on it there. It's at the top. You can't read it, but it's been transcribed by other people with better eyes. And it says that what you can read there, a specimen is great spelling. There were no spell checkers, and the spelling of the journals is quite interesting. It makes it fun to do, searches of the journals. You can't find things. But specimen of liliaceous plant, obtained on Brant Island, 10th April, 1806. The root of this plant is a squamous bulb and is eaten by the natives. The Klalelar opposite this call it the Telblakthilpa. So this is a small label, it's short, but in this one label you have botany, you have the type of plant, the location, and the date it was collected, which is what an herbarium sheet has to make it more than just a souvenir. You have the native use of it, you have the tribe name of the people that did use it, and you have the plant name in the native language. It's not earth-shaking, but it's quite interesting that you have this, and it's on the labels there. There are a lot of these labels. You can explore them yourselves. Cindy Schema from Morris Arboretum was a PI on a grant that we got to do the Academy of Natural Sciences herbarium, Eastern plants. So about 500,000 specimens were digitized, and all of those things are available now online. One brief note about tobacco. People ask if all the plants they found are still there. They are generally there. They're not extinct, except this was thought to be extinct, the variety of tobacco that was given to them at Fort Mandan. That was in 1999. Jim Reveal, who's the late great scholar of the botany of this, actually found this tobacco in 2013. And it's the only person on earth probably who would do a double take when this happened. But he walked by a garden at Fort Lewis, Fort Union, a reconstructed fort in North Dakota. And he must have thought, there is the Lewis's or the Arikara tobacco that was supposed to be extinct. He did what a good botanist would do. He collected it without permission, as far as I know. But we have the specimen at the Academy. And I've talked to some Native Americans about this, and there are seeds and tobacco plants kept. It's just nobody ever knew about it in detail. That fresh material can be used to do molecular work, and Rachel Meyer at UC Santa Cruz is doing a little bit on a leaf of that plant right now. So this is what it looks like today over at the Academy. 179 plants, which are actually owned by the APS, the American Philosophical Society. Long story, but we take care of them. It's a mutual beneficial arrangement. There are 47 that the Academy owns. Again, a long story, but we won't go into it. And then Kew Herbarium in London has 10. An even longer story, but they have 10 plants and they're not giving them back. 3 state flowers, 80 were new names to science at the time, and none are extinct today. And that leads me to the final thing. I want to acknowledge some colleagues of mine in the back here who are designing an exhibit to which I'm contributing in a very minor way called Botany of Nations, Indigenous Ecological Knowledge and the Lewis and Clark Core of Discovery. It starts about 2 months from today, almost exactly, and it'll run through February of next year. And it is focusing on that aspect of the Lewis and Clark plants that relates to indigenous knowledge. And so we have, is Cass here this morning? We have a videographer who's making a film, a Native American filmmaker. We're corresponding and collaborating and conferring with people like Sean Sherman, the Sioux chef, S-I-O-U-X, the Sioux chef, who was a famous chef. Other ethnobotanists, especially Enrique Salmon, who has written several books on this. He's at Cal State East Bay in California. So if your appetite is whetted for more information about this, especially for the indigenous knowledge part of this, please come to the exhibit and we'll see you there. So thank you.
I don't have any slides, just FYI, thanks. And then a quick question, how long am I talking? Okay. I have pages and pages, thus I'm just asking, you know. Okay, so one of the things I wanted us to reconsider, again, we were asked to talk about the idea of nation, and of course, part of the theme of this symposium is, I don't know, I guess a commemoration, I shouldn't say celebration, commemoration of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So I wanted us to rethink about kind of the idea of nation, especially during 1776, and what was here along the eastern seaboard, and of course what was in the rest of what would become the continental United States. And one of those things is a lot of different nations, right? So there's still a lot of different indigenous nations, even physically here, but also across what would become the continent. Whenever I say continent, I mean continental US. And they're nations that, for the most part, still exist today, even if they are not physically here anymore, because they got removed and or the people deported to other places in what is now the United States. So the idea of nation, we need to think about kind of nations, not just the United States as a nation here. And so I wanted us to think about not only the United States as a nation, but also these indigenous nations and their relationships with plants, and their long kind of standing both thinking of plants from religion and religious practice, right? That certain plants, for example, are sacred icons, to also plants being economic drivers in their own societies. So we know that these things happened, you know, before the United States existed, and it is been studied in the past and then sort of forgotten by folks, and then restudied currently. So I'll just name a couple of folks. Of course, Bill Cronin wrote a book, I think it's now 40, practically 50 years old, Changes in the Land. Charles Mann wrote 1491. He's a science writer, he's not a scholar. And then Kat Anderson did their dissertation and wrote Tending the Wild, which is about California. And several other scholars have talked about indigenous peoples, you know, kind of relationship to the land, et cetera. The other reminder I sort of want us to have is the reminder, in addition to that story, is that the idea that this is not a wilderness or wild, that has very much been embedded in U.S. philosophy, and it's also been codified, really, in U.S. law through the Wilderness Act, right? So we have written into the Wilderness Act that there are such places as, quote unquote, the wild places that are untouched by humans, because we have this long-standing philosophy that developed over time in what is now the continental U.S., that this was a place that was untouched by humans, and also that it was a place that was kind of like the Garden of Eden, right? It was kind of both. So it was kind of touched by God, untouched by humans. And we have carried that philosophy forward with us to this day. So right now I teach at the University of Illinois. I'm in the history department. I teach environmental history classes at the University of Illinois. Previous to that, I was at the University of Montana, where I was in the environmental studies, environmental science department. The idea of kind of wilderness is so embedded in US culture, it is almost like we have to have, I'm not sure what kind of surgery to kind of like really pull that apart. Every student that I encounter, probably most scholars that I encounter, have that sort of deeply embedded in their brains. And it doesn't matter sometimes, especially with students, like how much scholarship I share with them, and also having Indigenous people come to class and talk to them, that they, at the very end of class, guess what students write in their final papers? When Lewis and Clark came to Montana and found wilderness, right? So this kind of idea of wilderness is just so embedded in our American society. I don't know how to get it out. And maybe you guys can have some suggestions of how to get it out of our brain. But it's there. It's pervasive, and I have yet to encounter a student, unless they're Indigenous, who doesn't think about this differently. So that's something we need to sort of rethink about when we start thinking about, again, kind of these questions of talking about nation and nation states. The other thing I wanted us to think about related to that is, again, that, and this was mentioned last night at last night's talk, that a lot of the plants that we use today that are part of our economic systems worldwide came from the Americas, right? And last night was mentioned, of course, the Columbian Exchange and the work by Crosby and others who've written about these same things, talking about the plants that were introduced from the Americas to the rest of the world. And for those of you who are young, and maybe you don't have to be too young, there was a recent Saturday Night Live skit with Bad Bunny. Did you guys see this one? Where Bad Bunny is the emperor, of course, and they bring back all these different things from the Americas, and they get introduced to the turkey, right? And they get introduced to like giant pumpkins and different kinds of food, and and Bad Bunny's reacting to them, so the big pumpkin is all like ugly and stuff, and he's like, "What is that hideous thing?" So anyway, so it was, part of it was, introducing these different plants, and the skit ends with them introducing tobacco. And Bad Bunny and them start smoking the tobacco and like, okay, this one's good. We like this one. So the fact that Indigenous people have been having plants as a central part of their cultures and their societies is, of course, thousands of years old, right? And the domestication of plants here in the Americas, again, studies that have been done on this are, longstanding. So we need to think about those, because those sort of then make their way right back to Europe and kind of make their way back here, and now are central features of U.S. economy. I now live in central Illinois. I'm surrounded by corn. I think it's really pretty. It's super, super green. It's very tall. 90% of the year you're in this very green place. But it is a plant that has made its way kind of around the world and back to where it is right now. And most recently, the University of Illinois, but lots of other universities, were impacted by recent government policies that removed federal grants related to plants. Again, University of Illinois is very much kind of a STEM-focused university. We do a lot of ag work. We lost so many grants, millions and millions of dollars, having to do research on these different plants. But again, almost all of those plants are from the Americas originally. So it's kind of interesting, kind of those kind of things that go around. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of this particular topic that we're talking about today is, this is a gross generalization, but I'm going to make this gross generalization. For the most part, depending on the indigenous nation, it was almost always women and people who identified with womanhood that were the ones that were the cultivators of plants. Either being the ones that were working farms, so they were working domesticated plant species. They were in charge of also cultivating undomesticated plant species. So oftentimes, when there was something related to plants and plant communities, almost always it was going to be the women who were in charge of that, the women who were cultivating those, and the women who were teaching other people about those. So when folks were coming to, strangers to a new land, it was almost always the women that they would learn from, and or the voice of men as told through women. So Lewis and Clark is a good example of that. One of the things I focus on in my own work is I'm really interested in landscape management practices. So I'm really interested in how Indigenous people changed the land that they lived in. And I'm really interested in this idea of we are not living in a wilderness. So how exactly is it that people changed the land that they were in? And how were those different methods and methodologies kind of adapted over time, used over time, and how did, again, mostly women be able to transfer that knowledge down through the years? And I'm interested, again, both because of where I'm physically from. I'm from the Northern Great Plains of North America. So the Northern Great Plains is really kind of the watershed. You kind of saw a couple of maps up there with Lewis and Clark. It's part of the watershed of the upper Missouri River. So the Northern Great Plains crosses both the US and Canadian border. It's what is now kind of Montana, Alberta, Saskatchewan, if you know that region. And so this is a region that I do a lot of different research on. But I'm interested in kind of the landscape management practices of people in the Northern Great Plains because for the most part, they were not agricultural. So how did people change the land when you're not agricultural, right? And that is a question that I'm interested in looking into. And it is something that we kind of fall on the shoulders of lots of archaeologists who are doing the research to look at, peoples of the past, especially in the Americas. And I think that archaeologists are doing some really fascinating stuff. So I'll just say back in the day, archaeologists, especially in my region, almost always studied bison, right? They were always interested in big game hunters. They were interested in that whole kind of man the hunter, right? And didn't really do that much research on plants and or the role of women. Increasingly, they are. Right? There's more and more archaeologists. I've had students who are archaeologists who are beginning to do some of this research, but there's also now this collaboration that is occurring more and more between scholars and Indigenous people. One of the kind of missing elements to a lot of the research that scholars do, again, people increasingly beginning to do this, is actually talk to people who live there and talk to people who've been doing this for a really long time. I've been really fortunate that I've been educated in two educational systems, right? I'm educated in the Western education system. My undergraduate degree is in physics. When I was young, I was really fascinated with math and science, and I was hoping to be an astrophysicist. And I took kind of, a total turn to the other direction, to the dark side, the humanities. And I ended up getting a PhD in environmental history. But one of the things I'm really interested in terms of the Northern Great Plains is how people managed and changed the landscape so that they created places of abundance. They created places where they didn't have to leave. They created places where they didn't have to, quote unquote, follow the buffalo. They created places where they knew exactly where everything was, where they created places where, what you saw was not a wilderness. What you saw was not the Garden of Eden, but what you saw was a managed garden a cultivated garden, even though it was all undomesticated plant species. In my community, the only plant that we actually did grow in a garden was tobacco. And it was used primarily for two purposes. One was for religion and religious practice, for ceremonies and rituals, and it was also used for diplomacy. It was never smoked for secular purposes. It was never smoked, just like at the end of the day. They smoked other plants to do that. So there was kind of a secular purpose for some certain plants and then kind of a religious and diplomacy purpose. And tobacco was one of those plants. The tobacco that people smoke on the Northern Great Plains is historically not from there. Right, it's a plant that came probably from what is now California. Tobacco is a plant, and there's probably people out there who are specialists. I'm not gonna. That comes from South America, Central America, Mexico, what is now Mexico, and kind of up, kind of the California coast. It makes its way all across North America, all across South America before it jumps to the rest of the world. So as far as we know, the Blackfeet, which is the community I come from, they've been using tobacco for at least 2,000 years. And before that, smoked other things. But tobacco is one of those things that it doesn't come from there, right? But it ends up kind of being from there because it's been there for so many for thousands of years. And it is something that then returns in a different form when trade comes and it's a different species. And then we're impacted by kind of trade and stuff like that. I'm gonna look at my watch. Okay. So I wanted to end by sort of reminding us of all of those things. Sort of, there's nations here already. Those nations have relationships with plants. Lots of the plants that we use today were created by those nations, and that the people who are the ones cultivating these plants and that have the strongest relationships with these plants are, for the most part, women or people who identify with womanhood. So, thank you.
I'm going to first open up to the audience to make sure there's anything burning out here. Since they're such an esteemed group, but I'm happy to break the ice also. Yeah, please, there's a mic. Do we have rotating mics? Great. And for the audience, give your first name so that we can address you. That would be great.
Hi, thank you for the great talks. My name is Marina McDougall. I'm a colleague of Rick McCourt's on the Botany of Nations project. And my burning question is actually for Rosalyn LaPier. The term you used, non-agricultural practices, I was just curious about how you framed that, the language you use. I know we yesterday talked a lot about language, but in the way of thinking about, wilderness as being such a problematic idea, but these cultivated landscapes use the term garden. So I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, so I'm making a real distinction between what today we would consider a garden or farming. So farther down the Missouri River, what's already been discussed, the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, they were farmers, right? They had corn, beans, squash, sunflower seeds, tobacco, other plants that today we think of as domesticated plants, that you grow in a garden, and they were used for trade, right? Versus plants that today we call wild. This is one of the things we talked about last night. Like, we call them wild. I'm beginning to call them more cultivated, undomesticated plant species. So plants that people, indigenous people, definitely changed their habitat, treated them almost like a garden in terms of the basics, fertilizing them, moving them, pruning them, relocating them, etc. So we know that those kinds of things did happen. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about edible forests today as something very, we're aiming for, like to work within ecology. So I feel, especially in our research in Botany of Nations with Camas in particular, noticing all the land management practices that have helped to preserve it after industrial agriculture, but also the removal of people from those lands, and then how the plants are sort of suffering because they don't have that ongoing cultivation in some cases. So I think it's a really super fascinating area of work you're doing, and I look forward to learning more.
I'll just let people know really quick what they're talking about. Camas. So camas is a plant that you harvest the bulb of it. It almost looks like the bulb, just FYI, it almost looks like a daffodil. Like today, if you were to put daffodils in your garden, that's pretty much what the bulbs look like. And after it's harvested, you have to process it. You cannot eat it raw. You have to process it, and you process it by cooking it. And you cook it for multiple days. Back in the day, they used to do pits. They dig a pit and they would cook it that way. Today, the way most people do it is in a crock pot. Same difference, the modern method. And when you cook it, it turns into almost pure sugar. And it's not a carbohydrate. That's what it looks like. It looks like it might be a potato. It's not a carb. It's actually a sugar. And so people would then process it. It turns almost black. It kind of looks molassesy, and you pound it, and you can dry it, and you can keep it forever. It lasts forever. Okay, sorry, I'm just clarifying what camas is.
No, that's excellent. Other questions from the audience? Yeah, please. There's a hand there. I think it's Mia.
Yeah, hi, my name is Mia Devanza, and I'm the director of the Fine Arts Library that shares this building. And my question is for Chantel. I grew up in the American South in a place with a climate a lot like Charleston's and many of the same environmental challenges. And so when you were describing finding these caches of seeds in the walls, it made me curious about the state of what you were finding and how much of it was usable, because it made me think about living above a kitchen in a hot climate. It must have been extremely hot up there for the enslaved people who had to live there. And then the humidity as well. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, was it difficult to find a portion that was usable to, for the process that you used?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So the individual specimens oftentimes were fragmentary because they'd been collected by rodents. They had little rat chew marks on them and things, but they were still identifiable oftentimes to genus or to species. But as for the little sort of microenvironments inside the walls and underneath the floorboards, we really racked our brains trying to figure out why this stuff would have been preserved given this really humid environment. And it turns out that despite that, it still was better than what's occurring underground, right? That there's so much soil bacteria looking to break down organic matter that for the most part, these types of botanical materials, they just wouldn't have been preserved underneath the soils. So in the East Chamber upstairs in this second floor room, you're right, it would have been very hot. It would have been very humid up there. And we just this week got results back from our insect specialist who was finding lots of evidence for flies and things that would suggest that there also was meat, maybe salted meat, salted pork or something, also being stored up there. So it's possible that the reason why the rats had access to this material, this food material, is because enslaved people had their own stores up in the room. For the most part, in most kitchen houses, there would have been a locked cabinet downstairs, and that would have contained all of the sugar and spices and all the daily supplies, and that would have been basically carefully monitored by the white mistress of the house, and she would have taken a key and a little key basket, brought it to, because there's this whole tradition with the key basket, brought it to that locked cabinet, and then given the enslaved cook only a certain amount of food each day. Whether or not there were rations for the enslaved people, we don't know. And so it makes a lot of sense to me that people would have been storing foods upstairs if they had access to it in their rooms, despite the challenges of it going potentially bad in that humid environment. And rats and things and insects, there are lots of cockroaches that we found also looking to also, consume that material.
Cool question.
Sorry for mentioning cockroaches and rats.
Next question. Yeah, please. I love it when panelists ask each
I have a
other
question I'd like
questions.
to ask Rosalyn about the concept of wilderness and excising it and so forth. Yeah, when Lewis and Clark, when he was writing, Lewis was writing, setting out after the winter in North Dakota, he said, "Well, here we go." I'm paraphrasing. Here we go, my little flotilla of boats, not as grandiose as that of Captain Cook. And he mentioned Captain Cook, also not exactly having his moment in the sun now, but he thought we're going to go where no foot of civilized man has ever set. So I think in a sense he knew there were other people there, but I kind of compared this to me going to O'Hare Airport and saying, here I am in this unexplored territory with thousands of people wandering around. Nobody from my family has ever been here before, but I am really important. So he had that idea. I think there's another part of wilderness, though, that maybe
he also didn't recognize that the French had been there too, so he thought of the French as not being civilized man.
Okay. But there are other. There's the Wilderness Society. Maybe there are other aspects of wilderness that we sort of need to have to refer to, and that's why it's so romantic. It's not necessarily people saying, "Oh, it's because we conquered the wilderness," but because we want to preserve something out there about it that's another aspect of it. What do you think?
Okay, so places, there's a nonprofit organization, an NGO called the Wilderness Society that was created about when the Wilderness Act was passed in 1964. They have struggled recently, not back then, but recently, about whether or not they should have a different name, right? Like whether they should push back against this idea. And so now they have like on their website and stuff, like we have this different definition of wilderness. We realize, yes, there's people here, and yes, they change things. So they're trying to do that, but at the same time, yes. So there's this idea of we should be setting aside the natural world, right, from human use. So what does that mean? And I know that these NGOs are definitely thinking about these questions, and how can we do that with still not calling it wilderness? So they're thinking about it, but they have never changed their names. Yeah. So I think that's a conversation that's happening right now. Again, back to kind of the words that we use. I think that it's coming to a point though that they're going to think about changing their names, because they've had these conversations long enough to decide. Yeah.
That's good.
Oh yeah, please, thanks.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting. So my question is kind of from an environmental humanities point of view. So about 5 or 6 years ago, I read a book edited by William Cronin, Sheep Are Good to Think With. And so my question is this, and the presumption is that there's a deep intimacy between a human and a non-human creature. And so my question for any of you scholars is there writing out there that touches on that deep relationship that is sometimes part of the imagination and sometimes rational about plants and kind of deep, intimate relationships between humans and plant world in the context of your research and scholarship?
The quick answer is yes. I'll just give you a quick example and then ask Chantel to finish this. Okay. So there's this fiction book called The Seed Keepers by Diane Wilson. She's a writer from Minneapolis. She's Dakota, and at one point the Dakota were deported out of Minnesota to the Dakotas, and there's a story in her own family where when the deportation was happening, the women sowed seeds into their skirts so that when they left, and I think that's something similar that happened with enslaved people. Yeah. So I'm gonna jump it to you of the idea of like kind of almost embodying like your relationship when those times of crisis when in times of crisis happen.
Yeah, I think there are similar stories of enslaved people having braided into their hair the seeds and then making the passage across the Atlantic. But I feel like also I don't know if I'm a scientist. Archaeological scientists are kind of like dancing around science a little bit, and so I'm always looking again for material evidence too. And so I find myself kind of like struggling beyond the archaeobotanical record. And one of the ways that I've been able to try to bridge with historical sources and understanding the symbolic and cultural importance of plants is through cookbooks, and really looking at cookbooks like those by Tony Tipton Martin, and understanding the cultural significance of the ingredients and the stories, multi-generational stories that each of those ingredients embodies. So I don't know if that answers your questions, but that's where my mind goes to.
Wait 1 second. There we go.
Hello. I had to step out for a second, so if this was asked already, just let me know. I had a question about the idea around wilderness and like practical ways we can combat it. And I'm wondering how you feel the land back movement and conversation is in relation to that. And also, sorry, it's like 2 questions. I do that. But also like this idea of like, what is the first bastion of like disproving this thought? Is it with like private lands or public lands? Like I'm thinking of the national park system and how there's been some really interesting instances where the buffalo were brought back to Yosemite, and, you know, land back meaning we're giving the stewardship back. Is that like, and there are sites of extreme violence for our community. So I'm wondering if that's kind of like the first area, or if there's something that we can do in collaboration with people who have private land too. Sorry.
So in this particular case, I feel like this is not really answering your question. I'm pivoting. I think in this particular case, you know, I think I'm from out west. I think of myself as somebody from the west. People in the west, especially indigenous people, don't frame things as wilderness, right? And hardly ever use that word, the wild or wilderness. It's something that Americans do. And so to a certain extent, I feel like that's something that Americans need to fix, because we already fixed it. Like, we fixed that problem. You guys are the ones that keep doing, you know, like using the incorrect words. So I kind of feel like it's up to the Americans to figure out how they're going to fix that. Because it's one of those things, like once you know that you're using incorrect terminology, right, then it's on you to fix the incorrect terminology. Just FYI, I'm over 60. I feel like I'm old. Before I publish things, I have young people read what I write to make sure I am using correct terminology, because I already feel like I'm like from a different generation. Like, am I using the right words here? Would you guys use a different word? Like, how would you do this? So I have younger people, younger scholars, young emerging scholars read stuff, because I think that terminology is really important, because as we're kind of talking about with the symposium, you know, these words like nation and empire, they mean something, right? They mean something. And so we do have to be careful about kind of the terminology we use. But the idea of like wild and wilderness, that's something that y'all need to fix, not you, but you know what I mean.
I'm interested in the possibilities of, I'll ask the question to continue on. What are some of the other words that we can use? So I'm from the middle and I don't use the term wilderness. I think of open, wide. So are there terms that you might suggest to think about
No, it's
No.
up to you guys. I get asked that question all the time. It's like, well, Roz, what do you want us to do? You guys figure it out.
How can we show the stewardship that has been here for hundreds of thousands of years when it is accepted to death? American art,
Yeah, I have an answer, I think. I guess I would respond by saying, like, I give the archaeobotanical research back to the community. Like, it's, like, and people can do with that information what they want, So, for example, at the Nathaniel Russell house, it's now a museum, and owned by the Historic Charleston Foundation. And there was a committee created of community members who were thinking about their own ancestry and how they would like the story of the kitchen house told to visitors. Like, there are thousands of tourists who come through the Nathaniel Russell Museum every year, and many people focus just on like the grand like residence, and the kitchen house should be an important part of that story. And this group of community members are now thinking about, like, okay, how do we take the archaeological research and tell our own stories with it? So I would say, like, I would just want to provide the information to the people whose ancestry this is, and see if it can be of service to them.
And not to push Rick, but I'm interested in the records. What were how were descriptions of land, which are tied to what they were trying to learn, what were some of the specific words that they used across?
Oh, that's interesting. The word bluffs and prairies came out a lot. In fact, sometimes it just says, I've found this plant on the bluffs, with no other mention of anything. So that's a good question. I don't think I've done a word cloud about it, so I'm not sure how that works. The parts I've focused on in the journals are really the technical parts, where Lewis was trying to speak the language of Thomas Jefferson. And so he was using Latin terminology to describe things, which was kind of fascinating, because that all got X'd out of the first 100 years of the journals that ever came out. And in a way, the fact that they never published, quote unquote, the journals specifically, Lewis committed suicide and Clark never did it, and Professor Barton here at Penn died too. So instead, we actually now have the journals themselves to look at, so you can see the raw language itself and maybe find out that clue. That would be an interesting study to do, but it's not Bowdlerized in the sense of saying, and then we appeared over the mountains. Crest was the lovely vision of something or other. They didn't write like that. Yeah, I guess the most memorable phrase I remember is Lewis describing the, I can't remember the geological formation now, but he called it visions of enchantment. It was probably the most poetic part. He was more the poet. Clark was more like, let's just write it down and get it out of the way. But Lewis would rhapsodize about things, almost metaphysically in some ways. And Clark was writing out numbers and distances and things like that, and drawing pretty good maps, and talking to Native Americans about their maps too, not appreciating them, but they relied upon them as well. So I don't have a good answer for that, but somebody else could do that. They're all
Study for the next graduate student. I think we have time for one more question and then a little pause before the next thing. So great, Brian. There's a mic here. I'll give you mine. Oh, Joyce, yeah.
So thank you for tackling America 250. I think all the cultural institutions are like figuring out what to do with it. Thinking about like 18th century Philadelphia, and what was if you could paint a picture of what the landscape was like here with Bartram and the native peoples here. Could you just like describe like how much he interacted? What was that landscape like before? I think Lenape got pushed out towards the end of the 18th century, I'm guessing, or could you just like describe a little bit what it was like here, like 1700 up until, yeah, I don't know if you just like, if you know, just to see what was the landscape like here as we're kind of approaching this America 250, and what are we celebrating? Well, not that part, but what was it like here that we're like looking back to?
Well, I would say from my limited knowledge, that the Lenape had for the most part been pushed to the periphery very, very early in the 18th century, and that even the rural portions around Philadelphia were already the garden estates of like wealthy white men. Spring-Gittsbury, like William Penn established Spring-Gittsbury and Fairmount, 1683. That was a huge, huge area of what's today Fairmount, Spring Garden, Brewery Town, Strawberry Mansion, and that was all William Penn's, in quotations, William Penn's land. And I guess I'm thinking too about that when we talk about the botanical history of Philadelphia, we're also like not acknowledging a lot of the garden workers, right? And skilled labor of the gardens. Like when we talk about William Hamilton, for example, an indentured gardener who worked for him was George Hilton, who has never been fully studied or appreciated for the many decades of garden knowledge that he provided. We talk about Frederick Persh and John Lyon, who were gardeners at the Woodlands, but not George Hilton, who was, as I said, indentured and then later free. We don't talk about the gardener at Spring-Gittsbury. We maybe talk about James Alexander, who was the Scottish-trained white gardener who was there, but we don't talk about Virgil Warder. So I think there's a lot more research to be done about the detailed histories of these garden estates, but very, very early on, I think a lot of this land had been like sectioned off into what became these country estates. That's just one part of it, I think.
I don't have anything to add to that, I don't think. No, sorry.
I think on that note, I want to thank the scholars here for sharing all of your incredible work and coming long distances.